The phrase doesn't land as accusation. It lands as disorientation. Your mother was one of them, doesn't point to a person, it points to an inheritance you've sensed without being able to name. A familiarity with things left unsaid. An early awareness that some truths live beneath language, passed not through explanation, but through presence. You've carried this feeling since before memory had edges. The sense that your origin held layers others didn't notice. That what shaped you wasn't just environment, but exposure, to silence, to restraint, to a depth of knowing that never announced itself. You didn't grow up with answers. You grew up with atmospheres, with moods that lingered, with signals that taught you to read between lines long before you knew why that skill mattered. The word mother here is symbolic. It represents origin, imprint, transmission. Not doctrine or confession, but orientation. The way a nervous system learns what is safe. The way attention learns where to rest. The way intuition forms before logic. Some inherit certainty. Others inherit sensitivity. You inherited the latter, and sensitivity, when untrained, feels like mystery. You may remember how early you learned to observe rather than ask, to sense rather than demand clarity, to adapt to what was present without needing it named. This didn't make you passive. It made you perceptive. You learned to read shifts in tone, energy, and absence. You noticed when something was withheld, not out of malice but out of protection. That pattern stayed with you. One of them doesn't imply allegiance or ideology. It implies position. Standing at the edge of systems without fully entering them. Understanding how things work without being consumed by them. Carrying knowledge quietly, knowing that timing matters more than disclosure. This position is rarely chosen. It's inherited through proximity to someone who already knew how to hold it. You might feel a strange mix of loyalty and distance when you think about your origin. Not conflict, complexity. Love that wasn't loud. Care that showed up as boundaries rather than reassurance. Guidance that came through example instead of instruction. These forms of care are easy to miss, especially in a world that equates volume with presence. As you sit with this idea, something becomes clear. You didn't inherit secrets. You inherited discernment. The ability to sense what should remain quiet and what is ready to surface. That ability shaped your life in ways you're only beginning to recognize. It influenced how you trust, how you wait, how you choose when to speak. This story isn't about uncovering a hidden identity. It's about recognizing an inherited stance toward the world. A way of moving carefully, precisely, without needing permission. That stance didn't begin with you, but it lives in you now. And as this realization settles, a deeper question emerges, one that doesn't accuse or glorify, but clarifies. What did you learn before you had words, and how has it been guiding you ever since? The answer doesn't arrive yet, but the pattern has been there all along. As you sit with that inheritance, you begin to recognize how deeply it shaped your early orientation to the world. You didn't enter life assuming safety was guaranteed. You learned instead that safety was maintained, watched, adjusted moment by moment. This didn't make you fearful, it made you attentive. You became someone who notices shifts before they become event. You may recall how you sensed unspoken rules long before anyone explained them. You understood when to speak and when silence carried more weight. You learned that some things lose their power when exposed too early, and others lose it when hidden too long. This balance wasn't taught directly. It was absorbed through proximity, through watching how your mother moved through situations without drawing attention, yet never being unaware. One of them begins to feel less mysterious and more precise. It refers to those who stand close to systems without dissolving into them, who understand structures without worshiping them, who see patterns and consequences clearly enough to avoid spectacle. This way of being doesn't seek control. It seeks continuity. And continuity is learned early, often before conscious memory forms. You might notice how this inheritance affected your relationship with trust. You don't give it quickly, but when you do, it's steady. You don't rely on declarations or promises. You read consistency. This made relationships slower to form, but harder to break. You learn to value what endures over what impresses, because you watched someone do exactly that. There's also a pattern of emotional containment that now makes sense. You weren't encouraged to dramatize inner state. You were shown how to carry them. This didn't suppress feeling, it refined it. You learned that emotion doesn't need to spill outward to be real. It needs to be integrated. That integration became part of your default state. You may remember moments when others accused you of being distant, reserved, or hard to read. What they sensed wasn't absence, it was calibration. You were measuring before engaging, choosing before committing. That habit didn't come from distrust. It came from an inherited understanding that not every environment deserves full access. As this perspective settles, you see how much of your life has been guided by timing rather than impulse. You don't move just because something is possible. You move when it's sustainable. This often put you out of sync with others, but it kept you intact. The cost of speed was never hidden from you. You saw it modeled early. This reframing doesn't elevate your origin into something mystical. It grounds it. It shows you that what was passed down wasn't secrecy, but discipline of perception. The ability to live with partial information without panic. To hold awareness quietly until conditions align. That ability became your compass long before you realized you were using it. And now, as you recognize this inheritance clearly, the story begins to shift again. Not toward revelation, but toward responsibility. Because once you see what shaped you, the question is no longer where it came from. It's how you carry it forward, consciously, deliberately, and in your own way. As you sit with that inheritance, you begin to recognize how deeply it shaped your early orientation to the world. You didn't enter life assuming safety was guaranteed. You learned instead that safety was maintained. Watched. Adjusted moment by moment. This didn't make you fearful, it made you attentive. You became someone who notices shifts before they become event. You may recall how you sensed unspoken rules long before anyone explained them. You understood when to speak and when silence carried more weight. You learned that some things lose their power when exposed too early, and others lose it when hidden too long. This balance wasn't taught directly. It was absorbed through proximity, through watching how your mother moved through situations without drawing attention, yet never being unaware. One of them begins to feel less mysterious and more precise. It refers to those who stand close to systems without dissolving into them, who understand structures without worshiping them, who see patterns and consequences clearly enough to avoid spectacle. This way of being doesn't seek control. It seeks continuity. And continuity is learned early, often before conscious memory forms. You might notice how this inheritance affected your relationship with trust. You don't give it quickly, but when you do, it's steady. You don't rely on declarations or promises. You read consistency. This made relationships slower to form, but harder to break. You learn to value what endures over what impresses, because you watched someone do exactly that. There's also a pattern of emotional containment that now makes sense. You weren't encouraged to dramatize inner state. You were shown how to carry them. This didn't suppress feeling, it refined it. You learned that emotion doesn't need to spill outward to be real. It needs to be integrated. That integration became part of your default state. You may remember moments when others accused you of being distant, reserved, or hard to read. What they sensed wasn't absence, it was calibration. You were measuring before engaging, choosing before committing. That habit didn't come from distrust. It came from an inherited understanding that not every environment deserves full access. As this perspective settles, you see how much of your life has been guided by timing rather than impulse. You don't move just because something is possible. You move when it's sustainable. This often put you out of sync with others, but it kept you intact. The cost of speed was never hidden from you. You saw it modeled early. This reframing doesn't elevate your origin into something mystical. It grounds it. It shows you that what was passed down wasn't secrecy, but discipline of perception. The ability to live with partial information without panic. To hold awareness quietly until conditions align. That ability became your compass long before you realized you were using it. If you've been touched by God's goodness, don't keep it to yourself. Click Super Thank You, and sow a gift of $20 or more to help spread His light. Your giving becomes a ripple of grace, blessing hearts and building His kingdom. Let His overflow pour through you. And now, as you recognize this inheritance clearly, the story begins to shift again. Not toward revelation, but toward responsibility. Because once you see what shaped you, the question is no longer where it came from. It's how you carry it forward, consciously, deliberately, and in your own way. Impact doesn't announce itself with volume. It shows up as effect. You begin to notice how your presence alters outcomes without effort. Conversations stabilize. Conflicts lose momentum. Decisions clarify simply by being held in your awareness. This isn't influence you chased. It's influence that emerged because your internal structure became reliable. You may recognize how often you're now placed at moments of transition. Not always visibly, not always officially, but precisely when something needs steadiness more than speed. Others sense this before they articulate it. They don't always know why they trust you, but they do. Trust accumulates around those who don't leak energy under pressure. This is where the inherited stance fully matures. You're no longer guarding knowledge. You're applying judgment. You know when to intervene and when to let processes resolve themselves. You understand that not every issue requires correction, some require space. This restraint prevents escalation and preserves momentum where it matters. You might reflect on how different this feels from earlier phases of your life. Back then, awareness was internal and often heavy. Now it's external and functional. What once felt isolating now feels stabilizing. You're no longer alone with perception, you're using it in context. That transition marks growth, not loss. There's also a refinement in how you choose commitments. You don't say yes because something is important. You say yes because it's appropriate. You recognize the difference between urgency and relevance. This discernment protects you from burnout and ensures that when you do engage, your contribution lands fully. You may notice how your reactions have slowed, but your responses have sharpened. You don't absorb chaos. You observe it. You don't mirror anxiety. You neutralize it through presence. This ability didn't come from detachment. It came from years of learning how to stay regulated when others weren't. As impact becomes visible, the story sheds another layer of mystery. One of them no longer refers to origin or lineage. It refers to function. Those who can hold complexity without dramatizing it. Those who move systems without dominating them. Those who understand that real change happens quietly, through consistency rather than force. This realization doesn't inflate identity. It simplifies it. You stop asking what role you play and start noticing where your presence is most useful. That question guides you more accurately than ambition ever could. Use replaces image. Contribution replaces validation. The narrative is narrowing now, not toward an ending, but toward precision. What you carry is no longer forming or being tested. It's operating. And because it operates without spectacle, it doesn't need protection anymore. It needs placement. The next movement will bring that placement into focus, not as destiny but as fit, where what you carry meets what's required. Fit reveals itself through ease rather than excitement. You feel it when effort produces clarity instead of friction, when engagement deepens alignment rather than draining it. This is not comfort, it's accuracy. You're no longer forcing yourself into contexts that require translation. You're entering spaces where what you carry is already legible. You may notice how your sense of belonging has changed. It's no longer tied to approval or familiarity. It's tied to usefulness. When your presence contributes naturally, without performance, you feel settled. When it doesn't, you disengage without resentment. This selectivity isn't withdrawal. It's respect for proportion. The inherited discipline you once carried quietly now guides placement openly. You recognize which environments can hold nuance and which collapse under it. You don't judge either. You simply choose accordingly. This discernment saves time, energy, and unnecessary conflict. It also protects what you carry from being diluted by constant justification. You might reflect on how earlier in life you tried to adapt yourself to fit context. That instinct has inverted. Now you let contexts reveal whether they can fit you. This isn't entitlement. It's efficiency learned through experience. You understand that constant self-adjustment erodes coherence, and coherence is your greatest asset. There's a noticeable shift in collaboration. You're no longer asked to convince, only to contribute. When your input is invited, it's because the system recognizes what it lacks. You don't arrive as a solution, you arrive as a stabilizer. That role doesn't demand visibility. It demands reliability. You may also sense a narrowing of distractions. Fewer options feel compelling, not because possibility has shrunk, but because alignment has clarified. You're less tempted by novelty and more responsive to relevance. This makes progress quieter, but more durable. Momentum builds without strain. As fit becomes consistent, the narrative sheds another illusion. That impact requires dominance. You see now that influence accumulates where coherence persists. By staying proportionate, you avoid backlash. By staying precise, you avoid waste. This method isn't dramatic, but it's effective. The phrase, "your mother was one of them," fades into background context. What matters now is how you operate. Inheritance gave you tools. Maturity decides how they're used. You're no longer echoing an origin, you're expressing a function refined by time. This phase doesn't close doors. It closes questions. You stop asking where you belong and start noticing where you're already effective. That noticing simplifies movement. It also restores energy once spent on doubt. The story continues to narrow toward its final movements, not toward revelation, but toward consolidation. What you carry has found ground. What remains is to understand how to sustain it without losing balance. That understanding comes next, not as instruction, but as confirmation. Sustainability becomes the quiet focus now. You're no longer asking how to enter spaces or influence outcomes, you're learning how to remain without depletion. This is where many stories lose coherence, but yours doesn't, because endurance was built into you early. You were trained, subtly, repeatedly, to hold attention without burning through it. You may notice how your rhythm has slowed without stalling. You take fewer steps, but each one lands. There's less urgency to prove relevance and more care in preserving alignment. This shift doesn't come from caution. It comes from understanding cost. You've seen what happens when momentum outruns structure. You've learned that pace is a form of intelligence. Your emotional economy has changed as well. You don't spend freely anymore. You invest. When you care, it's intentional. When you withdraw, it's clean. There's no drama in either movement. This makes relationships clearer. People know where they stand with you, even if they can't always explain why. Clarity replaces intensity. You might reflect on how this steadiness feels different from detachment. You're not distant, you're present without entanglement. You can engage deeply without losing form. That ability was inherited as sensitivity and refined through discipline. Now it functions as reliability. You're someone others can build around without fear of collapse. This is also where self-trust stabilizes fully. You don't second-guess instincts that have proven consistent. You still reflect, but you don't spiral. You adjust, but you don't abandon yourself. This balance allows you to sustain effort across long arcs rather than short bursts. The story you're living doesn't require spectacle. It requires continuity. The maternal imprint becomes almost invisible here, not erased but integrated. You don't feel guided by it consciously. You simply move in ways that honor what was modeled: discretion, proportion, timing. These values don't constrain you. They protect your capacity to keep going when others exhaust themselves chasing recognition. You may notice how challenges now feel different. They don't threaten identity. They test application. When something resists, you don't interpret it as rejection. You treat it as feedback. This removes emotional charge and preserves energy for problem solving. You respond instead of react. As sustainability takes hold, the narrative feels grounded. You're not building toward a dramatic peak. You're establishing a stable altitude. From here, visibility can increase without distortion, responsibility can expand without overwhelm, and impact can continue without erosion. Only 3 movements remain now. Not to add complexity, but to confirm what's already functioning. The story is no longer about becoming or revealing. It's about maintaining clarity while moving forward. The next movement will refine that clarity further, by showing you what not to carry anymore. Refinement always begins with subtraction. Not loss, but release. You start to notice what no longer belongs in your internal landscape, not because it's wrong, but because it's outdated. Roles you learned to play to stay balanced. Vigilance that once protected you but now consumes energy unnecessarily. These patterns served you well, but they don't need to follow you forward. You may recognize how often you once carried responsibility that wasn't yours, emotional weather that belonged to others, tension you absorbed simply because you were able to hold it. This capacity once felt like duty. Now it feels optional. You're learning that strength doesn't require constant accommodation. It requires discernment about where to stand and where to step back. There's a quiet relief in realizing you don't need to monitor everything anymore. The systems around you are more stable now, not because they changed, but because you did. You've developed enough clarity to trust that not every imbalance is your signal to intervene. Some things resolve better when you allow them to meet their own limit. You might notice how this shifts your sense of responsibility. It becomes more precise. You show up fully where your presence makes a real difference. Elsewhere, you remain unattached without guilt. This isn't withdrawal. It's focus. Energy once scattered across unnecessary vigilance now consolidates behind intention. The inherited sensitivity that once made you hyper-aware is now selective. You don't scan every environment automatically. You choose when to engage perception deeply and when to rest it. This protects your nervous system and preserves clarity. Awareness becomes a tool you use, not a state you're trapped in. As refinement continues, your boundaries feel less like defenses and more like architecture. They shape flow rather than block it. People who align move closer naturally. Those who don't drift without conflict. You don't manage exits. You allow coherence to decide. This phase also brings a deeper honesty with yourself. You stop carrying expectations simply because they were placed on you early. You evaluate them. Some you keep because they fit who you are now. Others you release without explanation. You don't need to justify subtraction. Alignment is justification enough. The phrase, one of them, loses any remaining mystique here. It doesn't describe a group. It describes a capacity, the ability to hold awareness without being consumed by it. You've learned when to engage and when to disengage. That skill allows you to move forward lighter without becoming careless. As this part settles, you feel more available, not less. Available for work that matters. For relationships that are reciprocal. For presence that doesn't cost you yourself. You're no longer defined by what you carry. You're defined by what you choose to keep. Two movements remain. One to stabilize this lighter structure. And one to close the narrative without closing your openness to what comes next. Stabilization isn't about tightening control. It's about trusting the structure you've built to hold without constant reinforcement. You begin to feel how much less effort it takes to remain grounded now. Not because challenges disappeared, but because your responses no longer overreach. You meet situations at their actual scale instead of their emotional echo. You may notice a new steadiness in your body before you notice it in your thoughts. Breathing slows. Decisions land without ripple. Even uncertainty feels contained, like weather passing through a well-built space rather than a storm breaking windows. This physical calm is not detachment, it's integration. Your system finally agrees with itself. The inheritance you once carried as vigilance now expresses itself as discernment without tension. You don't brace before entering rooms. You don't scan for hidden signals unless something genuinely requires it. This frees attention for creativity, for listening, for precise action. Awareness becomes lighter when it no longer needs to protect identity. You might recognize how this changes your relationship with conflict. You don't avoid it, but you don't escalate it either. When disagreement arises, you stay present without absorbing charge. You don't need to win or withdraw. You clarify. This clarity often resolves more than argument ever could. Stability has a quiet, persuasive power. There's also a shift in how you view responsibility. You're less inclined to rescue outcomes. You support processes instead. You trust that systems can correct themselves when given accurate input at the right time. This patience prevents burnout and keeps your contribution effective over longer arcs. As stabilization settles, your sense of self becomes less reactive to external definition. Praise doesn't inflate. Criticism doesn't collapse. You take in information without letting it reorganize you. This neutrality isn't indifference. It's proportion. You've learned how to stay permeable without being porous. The maternal imprint feels distant here, not forgotten, but complete. What was modeled has been absorbed fully enough to operate on its own. You're not reenacting an origin anymore. You're functioning from an internal standard that no longer needs reference points. That independence is quiet, but it's real. You may feel an unusual readiness, not for something dramatic, but for continuity. For sustaining clarity across changing conditions, for allowing your life to expand without losing center. This readiness doesn't announce itself. It rests beneath action, supporting it without demand. The story is nearing its close, not because there's nothing left to say, but because what needed to be said has become lived. Language steps back when structure holds. Explanation gives way to presence. One final movement remains, not to elevate the narrative, but to let it end where it belongs, inside your own ongoing life, intact and open. The ending arrives without ceremony. No reveal, no confrontation, no final explanation that ties every thread into something dramatic. Instead, there is a sense of placement. You are where you are meant to stand, and nothing inside you is arguing with that fact anymore. The story doesn't resolve by proving anything. It resolves by stopping the need to prove. You understand now that what was inherited was never a secret identity or a hidden role. It was a way of being oriented in the world, a posture toward power, truth, and timing, a refusal to rush what needs structure, a refusal to expose what needs care. This orientation didn't make life easier, but it made it stable, and stability is what allows continuity. You may notice how little you need the narrative now, not because it was false, but because it completed its function. It carried you through stages where direct understanding would have overwhelmed you. It framed complexity in a way your nervous system could absorb, and now that absorption is complete, the frame can dissolve without loss. Your life continues, but it does so without the background tension that once accompanied it. You don't feel watched by the past or pulled by unfinished questions. What mattered integrated itself quietly. You're not guarding anything anymore. You're simply present with what you are. This is where real stories end, not with answers but with capacity. The capacity to move forward without fragmenting, to engage without overextending, to care without losing form. You don't need to revisit where this came from to honor it. You honor it by how you live now. If there is meaning here, it is grounded and simple. Nothing was wrong with your beginning. Nothing needs correcting. What shaped you did its work. You are not carrying a mystery anymore. You are carrying clarity. And clarity doesn't announce itself. It holds. It continues. It remains usable. The story closes not by ending your movement, but by leaving you able to move freely, without distortion, without haste, without explanation. That is enough.